My daughter-in-law said, "You're old. It's time for you to rest." She smiled, took my mug off the table, and added that from now on, they would handle everything themselves. A few days later, I was no longer needed to pick up the grandkids from school. The dinner invitations stopped. I became a guest in the home I had built from the ground up with my son. But I didn't cry. I simply left. And a month later, she was working triple shifts, sleeping in the car, and searching for a nanny because I was resting, just like they wanted. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Margaret Wilson. I was 67 years old and had recently retired after working as a school cafeteria cook for over 35 years in Savannah, Georgia. It wasn't glamorous work, but I loved it. I loved the rhythm of it, the rising steam from early morning oatmeal, the laughter of children lining up for lunch, the smell of cornbread in the oven. I was good at feeding people, not just filling stomachs, but creating a sense of comfort, of home. After I retired, I moved in with my son David and his wife Lily. They had 2 children, Ben, who was 8, and little Sophie, who had just turned 5. David had a full-time job in logistics, often away for long hours, and Lily was a dental hygienist, constantly running between patients and school pickups. When they asked if I'd consider moving in to help with the kids, I didn't hesitate. It felt natural. I had always been a hands-on mother. Why would being a hands-on grandmother be any different? We lived in a 3-bedroom house on the edge of a quiet suburb, with oak trees lining the sidewalk and a small yard where the kids had a trampoline. My room was modest, just enough space for my books, a dresser, and a rocking chair that had belonged to my own mother. I didn't need much. What I needed was to feel useful. And in those early months, I did. My days had structure. I woke at 6, brewed coffee before anyone stirred, and prepped breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, fruit, or pancakes on Fridays. I made lunches, packed backpacks, double-checked homework, and tied shoes. I waited at the end of the driveway with Sophie until the bus came. In the afternoons, I helped with homework, supervised play dates, and started dinner before Lily returned home. The evenings were always the best. We'd gather around the table, talk about the kids' day, share stories, laugh at spilled milk. Sometimes I stayed up folding laundry or sewing buttons, humming quietly to myself. There was no applause, no official recognition, but I could feel it. I was the glue. I filled in every gap they didn't know they had. On weekends, I took the kids to the library or the park. I kept snacks in my purse, Band-Aids in the car, extra mittens in the hallway closet. I was the person who remembered dentist appointments, teacher conferences, and when the batteries in the smoke detectors needed changing. I didn't think of it as a burden. It was love, expressed in the invisible details. Lily would occasionally thank me, in passing, when things were especially hectic. "I don't know how we'd do this without you," she'd say, tossing her keys on the counter. But mostly it was understood. I was part of the machine, an essential but unspoken cog. David would hug me on his way out the door, sometimes with a kiss on the cheek. The kids adored me. Sophie called me her cozy grandma. Ben always saved me a seat next to him when we watched movies. I didn't expect grand gestures. I never had. I wasn't that kind of woman. My love was in the casserole on the table, the clean uniforms laid out every Monday, the packed lunch notes with stickers. It was in the way I carried them through the days, lightening their load without needing them to notice. But still, I sometimes caught myself staring out the window longer than necessary, wondering how I would fit into this home when the kids were older, when they didn't need help getting their jackets zipped or Band-Aids for their scraped knees. I wondered what I would become when usefulness no longer defined me. There was a difference between living in someone's house and being part of their home. In the beginning, I had believed I was both. I had unpacked my life into their closets, placed framed photos of my late husband on the mantel, arranged my spices beside Lily's in the kitchen. I had made space for myself without asking for much in return. And for a while, it worked. There was balance, there was warmth, but in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that I was still a guest, that my place, though valued, was conditional. I didn't listen to that voice. I buried it under grocery lists and morning routines, because I believed, deep down, that family didn't keep score. And so I gave, not just my time, but my presence. I was there every day, every hour. Holding together what no one else had time to see was fraying. And for a long time, I told myself it was enough. Until one day, it wasn't. It began with a single comment, harmless on the surface, but sharp underneath. We were in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. Lily was wiping down the counters, and I had just placed the last plate into the dishwasher. She didn't even look at me when she said it. "You're too old now, Margaret. You should really start thinking about slowing down." She said it casually, the way someone might suggest a new brand of laundry detergent. I chuckled politely at first, unsure if she was joking, but she didn't smile. She just kept wiping the counter, her movements quick, efficient, dismissive. Something about her tone stayed with me long after I went to bed that night. It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it. There was no warmth in her voice, no trace of affection. It was the kind of statement that wasn't meant to invite discussion, only signal change. The next morning, I woke before everyone else, as usual. I made coffee, but no one came to sit with me. I scrambled eggs and toasted bread, but by the time I called them to the table, Lily had already poured cereal for the kids. David mumbled something about a meeting and left with a travel mug. No one said thank you. That day, Lily took Sophie to preschool herself. She didn't mention it beforehand, just walked past me with Sophie's backpack slung over her shoulder and said, "We've got it today." I stood in the hallway holding a half-zipped lunch bag. I smiled as they left, but my hand trembled when I put the lunch back in the fridge. For the first time in years, I had a morning to myself. It should have felt like a break. Instead, it felt like absence. Over the next few days, small patterns began to shift. Lily started doing the laundry on Saturdays, folding it late at night after the kids were in bed. David began picking up groceries on the way home. The calendar on the fridge, which I used to keep updated with school events and appointments, was replaced by a digital one on Lily's phone. The house began to function without me. At least, that's how it was designed to appear. No one said the words out loud, but I felt it everywhere, in the way they walked past me in the kitchen without making eye contact, in the way they answered my suggestions with "it's fine" or "already handled." One afternoon, I went to pick up Ben from school like I always had. But when I arrived, the teacher told me he had already been picked up by Lily. She hadn't told me. She hadn't even texted. I drove home in silence, the empty car seat behind me a quiet confirmation. It was no longer just a comment. It was a pattern, a shift. That evening, I sat at the dinner table while the kids chattered about their day. Lily smiled and nodded, but her eyes never met mine. David scrolled through his phone between bites. I passed the green beans. No one took them. Later that night, as I folded a pile of dish towels, I realized something painful. I had become a redundancy. I wasn't part of the plan anymore. It was subtle, like the slow drip of a leaking faucet. One day, everything worked. The next, you start to notice the stains forming beneath the surface. They didn't ask me to leave. They didn't criticize me directly. That would have been easier to respond to. Instead, they rewrote the roles silently, pushing me out one routine at a time. What hurt wasn't the loss of tasks, it was the quiet dismissal of my presence. I began to feel like furniture, useful, dependable, but no longer seen. And still, I tried to stay helpful. I continued cooking, folding, cleaning, pretending not to notice the shifting dynamics. But every act of service now felt like a silent question. Am I wanted here or merely tolerated? It wasn't until I overheard Sophie whisper to Lily, "Why doesn't Grandma do everything like before?" that I felt the cracks split deeper. Lily responded with something I couldn't fully hear, but her voice was firm, certain, final. I stood in the hallway, unseen, holding a basket of folded laundry. And in that moment, I knew the home I had helped hold together was slowly closing its doors around me, not with cruelty, with indifference. And indifference, I learned, was far colder than anger. There was no announcement, no dramatic confrontation, no slammed doors or weeping children. When I left, it was as quietly as I had lived there. The decision didn't come all at once. It unfolded gradually, like a fog lifting. At first, I tried to convince myself that the coldness was temporary, that the distance was circumstantial. But with each passing day, I felt myself fading into the background. I no longer felt like a presence in the home, just a shadow, a memory still occupying space. I began to notice how often I tiptoed around my own routines. I waited until everyone was asleep to run the dishwasher. I kept my voice low when talking on the phone, careful not to disturb. I avoided the living room when Lily was watching television. I stopped making breakfast, then stopped eating breakfast altogether. There were mornings when I stayed in bed until noon, not because I wanted to rest, but because I no longer had a reason to rise. The children no longer needed my help with homework. Lily had hired a part-time babysitter for the afternoons. My calendar was empty. The hours stretched long and gray. One morning, I stood in the kitchen holding a dish towel and stared out the window at the backyard. The trampoline sat unused, damp from last night's rain. I realized I hadn't heard the children laugh in weeks, not the full, chaotic laughter that once filled the house. Everything had gone quiet, and somehow, in that quiet, I found clarity. I didn't belong there anymore. That evening, after the house had gone to sleep, I opened the bottom drawer of my dresser and pulled out the folder where I kept my personal documents: birth certificate, social security card, a savings account statement I hadn't looked at in over a year. I ran my fingers over the edges of the papers, grounding myself in the reality of my own name, my own life. The next day, I called an apartment complex I had once bookmarked months earlier, back when I first moved in with David and Lily, just temporarily. It was small and simple, located on the quieter edge of town. I scheduled a viewing for the following Monday. I didn't tell anyone, not yet. I needed the space to decide on my own terms. I packed slowly over the next few days. A few sweaters, a couple of dresses, my knitting needles, a small box of recipe cards worn soft with use. I wrapped family photographs in kitchen towels and placed them in a canvas tote. I left behind the bulky furniture. I didn't need much, just a bed, a chair, a table, something that could be mine again. By the end of the week, my room looked almost the same as always, except for the empty spaces where my life used to sit. I taped a small envelope to the refrigerator door late that night. Inside was a note, just a few sentences. "Thank you for letting me be part of your home. I've decided it's time for me to rest, as you kindly suggested. I'm safe. Please don't worry." I didn't expect a response. I didn't need one. That Saturday morning, before the sun had fully risen, I loaded the last of my bags into the trunk of a rented car. The air was still, the neighborhood hushed. I paused on the porch for just a moment. The wind lifted the edge of the welcome mat. A dog barked in the distance. Then I turned the key in the ignition and drove away. No one saw me go, and in that silence I felt something I hadn't in a very long time. Peace. The first crack in their carefully controlled world came sooner than I expected. It had been 2 weeks since I moved into my new apartment. The walls were still a bit bare, and my routine was not yet fully shaped, but I was learning to breathe again. Mornings started with tea instead of tasks. I took long walks in the nearby park, watching the leaves shift color with the slow patience of fall. My world had quieted, but in the best way. It wasn't silence from being excluded. It was silence I chose. Then, one afternoon, my phone rang. It was Lily. Her name lit up the screen like a flare in the sky. I let it ring once, twice. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Her voice was tight, not angry, strained. She told me their part-time babysitter had flaked out and asked if I could come by just for the afternoon to help with the kids. She added that it would really help, said she didn't know who else to ask. I told her no. I didn't offer a reason. I didn't apologize. I just said I wasn't available. The line went silent. Then she muttered something under her breath and hung up. That night, I sat by the window and watched the traffic lights blink in the distance. The rejection felt heavy at first, not because I regretted it, but because I knew what it represented. I had crossed a line. I had stepped fully out of the role they had assigned me, and now they had to reckon with the hole I left behind. The next few days were quiet again. Then David called. His voice was steadier than Lily's, but underneath it was the same thread of unease. He told me things had been a little hectic, that the kids were acting up and meals had become a mess. He said he didn't know how I managed everything so easily. He asked how I was doing. I answered kindly, but briefly. I told him I was well, that I had joined a community center near my apartment, that I was learning how to paint, though not very well. He laughed politely, but there was an edge to it, like he didn't know what to do with the version of me that had a life outside of them. He didn't say the words, but I heard them anyway. Come back, make it easier again. I didn't offer. By the end of the week, I started hearing from people in town. A friend from church ran into Lily at the pharmacy. She said she looked tired, distracted, like someone pulled too tight. The school sent home a note with Ben, apparently, saying he had missed 2 homework assignments. Sophie had been late 3 times in 1 week. The rhythm they had so carefully replaced me with was beginning to falter. It wasn't vindication I felt. It was recognition. They were realizing, slowly, painfully, that the things I did weren't just chores. They were care. They were structure. They were love in motion, love without fanfare. I had woven myself into their lives so seamlessly that they didn't notice the threads until they began to unravel. The final thread that week came in the form of a voicemail. It was Lily again. She didn't ask me to come back. She just said she was sorry things had gotten weird and that she hoped I was okay. Her voice cracked at the end, just slightly. She didn't say goodbye. She hung up mid-sentence. I listened to it twice. Then I deleted it, not out of cruelty, out of clarity, because I had spent so many years responding to every need, every crisis, every unspoken request. And now I was learning to let those calls go unanswered. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally cared about myself enough to let others stand in the mess they made. They weren't falling apart. Not yet, but the first fracture had formed. And fractures, left unattended, grow. And I wasn't going to be the one to hold their structure together anymore. Not with my time. Not with my silence. Not with my presence. That part of my life was over, and something new was beginning to take its place. Something honest, something mine. The unraveling wasn't dramatic. It was steady, almost methodical, like watching something slowly collapse under the weight of its own denial. I wasn't there to witness it firsthand, but I could see the outlines clearly through the cracks they tried to patch with silence. It started with Sophie getting sick. Nothing serious, just one of those spring colds that moves from one child to the next like a whisper. Normally, I would have made soup, taken her temperature, stayed up through the night if needed. But this time, Lily had to call off work. Then David had to shift his meetings. Neither of them had backup. There were no contingency plans when I was gone, because they had never needed one. One sick child meant a week of chaos. Then the sitter they'd hired to replace me quit. She was a college student, nice enough, but not reliable. She missed mornings, forgot pickup times. Once she even left the kids with a neighbor because she had to run. Lily didn't tell me that directly. I heard it from a neighbor I ran into at the farmer's market. Her voice was tight with sympathy, the kind people use when they don't know what side they should be on. By the end of the second week, Lily was working late nights at the clinic, picking up extra shifts just to keep up. She started falling asleep in the break room between patients, then getting up before dawn to prep lunches, drop off kids, and squeeze in a grocery run. David wasn't doing much better. He had lost his promotion track after too many absences, and the cracks in his perfect professionalism began to show. I could picture them, Lily in her scrubs, circles deep under her eyes, rushing from the front door to the car, snapping at the kids, forgetting her own keys. David staring blankly at his laptop after another complaint from a supervisor. Both of them spinning, spiraling, scrambling to hold together what I had once made seamless. They had underestimated the scaffolding I'd provided, the invisible kind, the meal planning, the emotional regulation, the soft hands that caught the pieces before they hit the ground. When I left, they thought the structure would stand. It didn't. 3 weeks in, I received a voicemail from David. His voice was worn thin. He sounded less like my son and more like a man treading water. He said he knew they had made mistakes. He didn't spell them out, but he didn't need to. He asked if I'd consider coming over just a few times a week. He promised it wouldn't be like before. He said he'd pay me. That last part made me sit down. Pay me. He had never said those words in his life, not once. Not during the years I ran their household like clockwork. Not during the late-night fevers, the grocery runs, the birthday parties I planned while standing barefoot in the kitchen. It wasn't the money that struck me. It was the desperation behind the offer, the sudden awareness that what I had done all those years wasn't just love, it was labor. I didn't call him back. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea, opened the windows of my small apartment, and listened to the breeze shuffle through the trees. I was learning to be still again, to live in a world where my value wasn't measured by how many meals I cooked or how many tears I wiped. The next week, I heard from a friend that Lily had taken on a third shift. Not just late nights now, weekends too. She started keeping a blanket in her car and napping between appointments. The kids were showing up to school with unfinished homework and cold Pop-Tarts in their backpacks. Teachers were calling, asking questions that no one had time to answer. They were burning themselves out on both ends, trying to fix what they'd broken without admitting they'd broken it. That knowledge didn't bring me joy. It didn't feel like justice. It felt like consequence. I wasn't punishing them. I wasn't even angry anymore. I just wasn't their safety net anymore. And without that net, they were forced to face the fallibility of their own design. Once, I would have stepped in the moment the first piece shook loose. I would have taken Sophie's hand, folded the laundry, started dinner before anyone realized they were hungry. I would have saved them. Now I saved myself. I poured my energy into a different rhythm. I joined a seniors watercolor class. I started taking evening walks with a neighbor named Helen, who told me stories about her childhood in Vermont. I discovered I liked classical music, something I never had time to notice before. I cooked for myself. Sometimes I ate in silence. Sometimes I played music and danced alone in my living room. I wasn't rushing anymore. I wasn't waiting for permission to be a person. And meanwhile, they were still running toward a finish line they couldn't see, trying to keep up with a life they thought they had mastered. They hadn't realized the cost, but I had, and I was no longer the one paying it. They showed up on a Sunday afternoon without warning, without calling ahead, without even the decency of hesitation. I was in the middle of folding laundry when I heard the knock. Not the polite kind, not tentative. It was the knock of people who had reached the end of their rope and remembered where the rope had once been anchored. I opened the door to see all four of them standing there. David looked exhausted. His shirt was wrinkled, his jaw unshaven. He had lost weight, not the kind that comes from diet or exercise, but the kind that stress peels off slowly and cruelly. Lily stood slightly behind him, holding Sophie's hand. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her posture sagged with a kind of bone-deep fatigue. Ben leaned against the railing, staring at the ground, kicking the edge of the welcome mat with his sneaker. No one spoke for a moment. I just stood there, the laundry basket in my hands, my front door wide open. It was the most surreal kind of reunion, quiet, uncertain, and drenched in everything they hadn't said in weeks. Finally, Lily offered a smile, a weak one, more muscle memory than genuine feeling. She held out a small box of chocolates, the kind you grab from the grocery store on the way to somewhere you don't want to be. Her fingers trembled slightly. I didn't take the box. I didn't invite them in. Instead, I stepped back just enough to let the breeze pass between us. I leaned the basket against the wall and nodded once, motioning to the chairs on the porch. They sat down like people who hadn't rested in months. David cleared his throat. He started to say something, stopped, then tried again. He said they had been having a hard time, that things were harder than they'd expected, that the kids missed me, that they missed me. Lily nodded slowly but didn't speak. She kept looking at Sophie, as if the child could translate her silence into apology. They talked for a while. They talked about the babysitter who quit, about the mounting bills, about how hard it had been to juggle everything without help. They said the word help like it was a favor, like it hadn't once been the air I breathed daily for them. I listened, not with hostility, not with sympathy either, just clarity. They weren't asking me to come back, not directly. They were doing what people do when they don't want to admit they were wrong. They were offering olive branches wrapped in discomfort, hoping I'd take them as peace. I made tea. I brought it out to the porch and sat down across from them. I didn't rush to reassure. I didn't fill the silence. I let it linger, let them feel the distance they had created and the space I had grown to cherish. At one point, Sophie climbed into my lap. She smelled like peanut butter and shampoo. She pressed her face into my shoulder and whispered that she missed my stories. I stroked her hair and kissed the top of her head. I missed her too, but I didn't say it, because missing someone and returning to them are not the same thing. Eventually, David asked if I might be willing to visit sometimes, not move back, just visit, maybe once a week, maybe every other Sunday. I could hear the hope in his voice, the way he tried to keep it casual, not desperate. I didn't give him an answer. Instead, I asked how Lily was really doing. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. Then she just whispered, "Tired." And I believed her. They didn't stay long. There wasn't much else to say. They finished their tea and stood awkwardly, unsure of whether to hug me or not. I didn't move to embrace them. They walked back down the steps slowly, like people leaving a place of reverence or regret. After they left, I stood at the door for a long time, not sad, not satisfied, just present. I had opened my door, yes, but I hadn't opened the rest, because forgiveness and return are not the same, and some doors, once closed, are better left only slightly ajar. After that visit, something shifted, not in them, but in me. I didn't feel pulled back toward their world. I didn't feel the old tug of obligation or the ache of being needed. Instead, I felt a kind of grounded stillness, the kind that comes after you've stepped fully into your own life and realize you're not looking over your shoulder anymore. The next morning, I took my time waking up. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, not because anyone was expecting it, but simply because I wanted the smell to fill the room. I opened the curtains and stood barefoot on the rug, letting the morning sun touch my face. It felt like something sacred, this simple, slow ritual of choosing myself first. I began leaning deeper into this new rhythm. I signed up for a cooking class at the community center, not to sharpen old skills, but to try new ones. Thai, Mediterranean, even vegan baking. I wasn't cooking for a family anymore. I was cooking for joy, for curiosity, for me. There was an elderly woman in the class named Dolores who wore oversized jewelry and swore like a sailor. She invited me to join her knitting circle on Thursday afternoons. I accepted, even though I hadn't picked up my needles in years. My fingers were stiff at first, awkward, but the muscle memory returned, and so did the quiet pleasure of making something with my hands that didn't have a deadline or a purpose beyond its own existence. I started attending a small discussion group at the local library. We didn't always talk about books. Sometimes we talked about life, aging, memory, the way grief changes over time. I spoke more than I thought I would, listened even more. One man, Harold, told a story about how he taught himself how to dance in his 70s after his wife passed. I liked his voice, slow, deep, deliberate. He had kind eyes. We walked to the bus stop together one afternoon, and he offered me a butterscotch candy from his pocket. It made me laugh, and the laugh surprised me. I began to notice that I was no longer waiting for my phone to buzz. I no longer checked my messages with that quiet flicker of hope that someone might remember me. I stopped imagining myself back at David's house, back in the shadows of their busy lives. The fantasy had dissolved, and in its place was something sturdier, a sense of belonging to myself. I planted basil and rosemary in small ceramic pots on my windowsill. I rearranged my furniture, not because it needed it, but because I wanted the couch to face the window instead of the television. I replaced the plain curtains with ones that had bright floral patterns, bold reds and golds and deep greens. I started keeping fresh flowers on the kitchen table, even if it was just a single stem from the park. My home became a place that reflected me, not my usefulness, not my history, but my presence. One Saturday morning, I took a train 2 hours upstate to visit an art exhibit I had read about in the paper. I wore a scarf I hadn't worn in years and packed a small notebook in my bag. I walked slowly through the gallery, listening to the echo of footsteps on the floor, reading every placard, standing longer than necessary in front of a painting that reminded me of the ocean. On the way back, I watched the trees blur by through the train window and realized something that made my throat tighten, not with sadness, but with awe. I had a life now, a real one, not a supporting role, not a placeholder, mine. I still thought about David and Lily, of course, about the children. I missed them in a quiet way, like you miss the smell of something comforting, but know you can't go back to live in it. When they texted me short updates or sent photos from school recitals, I answered warmly. I never ignored them, but I didn't ask for more. I didn't offer more either. I had given enough. What remained of me now was not a reaction to their absence, but a celebration of my own presence. There were still moments of loneliness. Even peace has its echoes. But they didn't scare me anymore. I welcomed the quiet as a companion instead of a threat. It reminded me that I was whole, and each day, in small ways, I kept walking forward, not away from them, just toward myself. It was a quiet Wednesday when the envelope arrived. No fanfare, no courier, just a plain white envelope slipped through the mail slot with the rest of the week's clutter. I almost tossed it aside, assuming it was another local flyer or bank offer, but the handwriting stopped me. I recognized it. David's, still neat and deliberate, as if he believed penmanship could communicate sincerity. I opened it slowly, not with dread, but with calm curiosity. Inside was a short letter and a small photo of the kids, taken in front of their school on the first day back after spring break. They were both taller than I remembered. Sophie was wearing a headband I had knitted her 2 Christmases ago. Ben had David's serious eyes and Lily's uneven grin. The letter was simple. No apologies, no dramatic confessions, just acknowledgement. David wrote that things had been hard, that they'd learned a lot, that he hoped I was happy. He mentioned gently that if I ever wanted to come visit, for dinner, for a birthday, for anything, I would always be welcome. He didn't ask for more. He didn't assume. And for once, that felt like enough. I placed the letter in a small box where I kept the few things that still mattered from the life I'd stepped away from. I didn't cry. I didn't call him. I just sat with it for a while and let the silence wrap around me like a warm shawl. That evening, I sat out on my tiny balcony, wrapped in a knitted throw, a cup of mint tea in my hands. The sun dipped low behind the buildings, casting long streaks of orange and gold across the street. The wind was gentle. In the distance, I could hear someone playing jazz on an old radio. It drifted lazily through the air, notes rising and falling like a memory you don't need to hold tightly to in order to cherish. This was rest, not the kind they used to talk about, where you stop working because you're too tired to continue, not the kind that's given to you like a dismissal. No, this was rest I had carved out for myself, with intention, with strength, with the quiet refusal to be anyone's afterthought ever again. I filled my days slowly with things that nourished rather than drained. I baked bread on Sundays, the apartment filling with warmth and the smell of rosemary. I took naps in the afternoon when the light hit the couch just right. I visited museums, watched old black and white films, read poetry out loud just to hear how the words felt in my mouth. I had no one to impress, no one to manage. I had myself, and she was finally enough. I started writing, nothing big, just small stories, essays, reflections. I wrote about my mother, about the first kitchen I ever cooked in, about the sound of my name when it's spoken with care. I joined a writer's circle at the library, mostly women in their 60s and 70s, each one carrying a life full of things never said. We said them now, slowly, fiercely. One afternoon, as I was trimming the dead leaves from my basil plant, I realized something that made me pause. I no longer felt guilty for enjoying my own company. I no longer felt like I had to earn every moment of stillness by sacrificing pieces of myself. I had lived so many years through other people's needs. I had fed their hunger, softened their tempers, filled the cracks they didn't even see. And now, finally, I was feeding myself. I didn't owe anyone explanations. I didn't owe them a return. I had given enough. When I looked at my reflection now, I didn't see someone discarded. I saw someone who had reclaimed her name, her space, her time. I saw a woman who had rewritten the narrative. I wasn't the forgotten grandmother or the background caretaker. I was the author of my own quiet renaissance. Sometimes I thought about love, not the kind I'd lost, but the kind I might still find. A late love, a soft, unhurried, thoughtful love, the kind that walks beside you without asking for anything more than your presence. I hadn't ruled it out. I had joined a local community garden group, and there was a man named Frank who always brought extra gloves in case someone forgot theirs. He never assumed I needed help, but he always offered. That felt like something worth paying attention to. I started making plans, not as a way to fill time, but to claim it. I created a list, handwritten and pinned to the corkboard by my kitchen. Not a bucket list, but a becoming list. Things I wanted not to check off, but to live inside. I wanted to visit a vineyard in California and learn how to taste wine properly. I wanted to take a train ride up the coast to Portland and spend a day in bookstores. I wanted to enroll in a beginner's painting class and give myself permission to be bad at it. I wanted to go dancing again, not at weddings or family parties, but in a room full of strangers where nobody knew my story. I wanted to invite a small circle of women I'd met at the community center to a dinner party in my apartment. I would cook something complicated and light candles, even if it was just 6 of us and a borrowed folding table. I wanted to laugh until my cheeks ached. And I wanted to travel, maybe not far, but far enough. I started putting a little money aside every month, not saving out of fear like I used to, but saving for joy, for experience. I circled places on a map, looked up train schedules, subscribed to newsletters about travel for seniors. For the first time, the world didn't feel closed. It felt open and waiting. I began to imagine my future not as a stretch of empty space, but as a garden I could grow. I wanted to volunteer at the animal shelter once a week. I wanted to plant wildflowers in the median near my building. I wanted to find more corners of my city I hadn't walked yet. And yes, if the universe allowed, I wanted to fall in love again, gently, without rushing, without erasing who I'd become to fit into someone else's story. The most surprising part of this chapter of my life wasn't how much I had changed. It was how much I had returned to myself. As if the layers I'd peeled off weren't new things, but forgotten parts of me I was finally remembering. I earned this rest. And now I would build something on top of it. A second bloom. A life not defined by what I escaped, but by everything I was finally stepping into. Not as a reward, not as compensation, but as a beginning. Because I had been everything for everyone else for so long. Now I was being everything for me, and it was more than enough.